Vivid verses.
The reference took me 11 minutes to write. I remember the time because I looked at the clock when I started and again when I hit send, mildly pleased with my own efficiency, the way you're pleased when a routine task closes clean. Marcus Teller had worked under me for 2 years, back when I was still building out advisory relationships instead of managing them. And he'd been good, not exceptional, but reliable in the specific way that makes a junior person worth keeping. He asked precise questions. He didn't pretend to understand things he didn't. When he left the firm for a smaller shop, I didn't think much of it either way. People leave. Some come back around later needing something, and I've never minded being the kind of person they come back around to. So when he called 18 months later, cordial, a little rehearsed, asking if I'd be willing to write him a reference for a director-level role at a firm I only knew by reputation, I said yes before he finished the sentence. I wrote what I believed. Thorough, sound judgment, works well under pressure, the kind of language that means something because I don't use it loosely. I've written maybe 4 references in 15 years. I don't hand my name out. I sent it and didn't think about it again. I had a deal to run. The deal was mine in the way a deal can belong to one person without anyone saying so out loud. I'd sourced it, nursed it through 11 months of diligence and cold feet, and a board that changed its mind twice, and I was 3 weeks from a signature that would matter more to my year than anything else on my desk. I'd earned the right to a certain quiet confidence about it. I don't perform confidence. I just have it, and people around me learn to read it as a kind of weather. I found out about Marcus by accident, which is usually how you find out about things that matter. I was on a call with a woman named Priya, who runs capital markets for one of our co-investors, and she mentioned in passing, the way you mentioned something you assume the other person already knows, that she'd been surprised to see Marcus Teller's name on the buyer's side of my deal. Buyer's side, I said. Not a question. I don't ask questions I already suspect the answer to. I ask them to confirm shape, not to seek information. He's their internal lead now, she said. Business development, I think, or something adjacent. He mentioned he used to work with you. Said it like it meant something. It does, I said, and let the silence do the rest. I want to be clear about what happened to me in that moment, because it would be easy to describe it as anger, and it would be wrong. What I felt was closer to the sensation of a lock finding its pin, a click is settling into place. I understood immediately what had occurred, not because Priya told me anything more, but because I know how these rooms work. Marcus hadn't stumbled into that firm. He'd used my name to get in the door, and once inside, he'd positioned himself as the person who knew me, who understood the deal, who could walk his new firm past whatever I'd built and make himself the reason they got there. He wasn't planning to compete with me. He was planning to replace me, using my own credibility as the ladder. It was, I'll admit, well constructed. That's not a compliment I extended to him afterward. It's simply an accurate description of the architecture. I didn't call him. I want to note that clearly because it would have been a natural thing to do, the thing most people would expect. A confrontation, a demand for explanation, some venting of the particular offense of having your own generosity turned into a weapon against you. I had no interest in explanation. Explanations are for people who think there's a version of events that changes the outcome. There wasn't one here. Marcus had made a choice, and the choice was legible on its face. I didn't need him to narrate it to me. What I needed to do was understand the perimeter of the damage, and then close it. I spent that evening at my desk with a legal pad, which is something I do only when a problem requires more structure than my head alone can hold. I wrote down every person who mattered to the deal, the counterparty's board members, their outside counsel, the 2 other advisors circling the transaction, my own principals, a handful of people at adjacent firms who'd hear about it eventually whether I told them or not. 14 names. I looked at the list for a long time, not because I was uncertain what to do, but because I was deciding on sequence. Sequence matters more than most people realize. You don't say the same thing to everyone in the same order. You say the true thing, calibrated to what each person needs to hear in order to draw the correct conclusion on their own. That's the whole of my method, if you want to call it that. I don't lie. I don't need to. The truth, delivered without embellishment to the right people in the right order, does more damage than any story I could invent, because a story can be picked apart and the truth can't. I called Priya first, since she'd already handed me the thread. I want to close a loop, I said. Marcus worked for me 2 years ago. I wrote him a reference when he left his last shop, a strong one, because at the time it was accurate. I didn't know he'd use it to get into this deal, and I want to be straightforward that I don't consider him a reliable source of information about my work or my client relationships going forward. I'd rather you hear that from me than infer it. Noted, Priya said. There was a pause, the kind that tells you someone is recalibrating something in real time. Does this change anything on your end? With the timeline? No, I said. It changes what I think of him. It doesn't change the deal. That was true. And it was also the most useful sentence I said to anyone that week because it did two things at once. It told her the deal was stable, which mattered to her, and it told her, without a single unkind word, that Marcus's judgment could not be trusted, which mattered to me. I never said he'd lied. I never said he'd manipulated anything. I described a sequence of events and let her supply the adjective. The second call was to a man named Holt, who I'd known for 11 years and trusted the way you trust someone you've watched make the same good decisions across multiple cycles. He wasn't connected to the deal directly, but he sat on the board of a firm that did a great deal of business with the counterparty, and word moves through those rooms whether you push it or not. I called him not to warn him about anything specific, but because Holt is the kind of man who, once he has a fact, uses it wisely without being told how. You remember Marcus Teller, I said. Worked for me a while back. Vaguely. Good kid, I thought. He was. I wrote him a reference last year, in good faith. He's since used it to get himself installed as the internal point of contact on a transaction I've spent the better part of a year building. He's representing to his new firm that our relationship gives him some kind of advantage over me on it. Holt was quiet for a moment. Does it? No, I said. But it tells you something about how he thinks deals get won. It does, Holt said, and I could hear, even over the phone, that he'd already filed it somewhere permanent. I made 6 more calls that week, each one shaped to its listener. To a woman named Corvin, who ran risk for one of the lenders and who valued precision above almost everything. I gave her precision, dates, the exact language of the reference, the exact sequence of Marcus's departure and reappearance. To an old friend named Desai, who I knew would find the whole thing more interesting as a study in character than as a professional hazard, I let a little more dryness into my voice, because he'd have found anything else performative. I never once asked any of them to do anything. I never suggested a boycott, never asked for loyalty, never framed myself as wronged. I simply told each of them what had happened to me, accurately, and trusted them to be the kind of people who would act on accurate information the way competent people do, which is to say, quietly and in their own interest. That's the part people misunderstand about influence. You don't have to ask for it. You only have to be someone whose word is worth more than the other person's, and then tell the truth in a room, and let the arithmetic run itself. By the end of that week, I hadn't said a single sentence about Marcus that wasn't demonstrably true, and I hadn't spent a single minute wondering whether I was doing the right thing. There wasn't a decision to second guess. He'd made his. I was only responding to its shape. I kept working the deal as though nothing had changed, because from where I stood, nothing had. I still had the relationships that mattered. The ones I had built over 11 months of actual work, not 11 minutes of borrowed credibility. And those relationships were not going anywhere. What I was watching for over the following weeks was not whether Marcus would fail. That was inevitable the moment Priya said his name to me. What I was watching for was the shape of his failure, because that shape would tell me things about the people around him that I might need to know later. The first sign came 10 days after my call with Priya, small enough that most people would have missed it. Marcus had been scheduled to run a diligence call with our accounting team. A routine session, nothing that should have required more than an hour. It got pushed twice, then handed to a junior associate who clearly hadn't been briefed properly. I wasn't on that call. I heard about it from our own controller, who mentioned, with the mild irritation of someone whose time had been wasted, that the guy who was supposed to run point apparently got pulled onto something else. I didn't need to ask what he'd been pulled onto. I understood that Marcus's own firm had started to notice the gap between what he'd promised, access, relationship, and inside track, and what he could actually deliver, which was nothing beyond what any competent junior person could produce with a data room and a checklist. Once that gap becomes visible to the people who hired you for the promise, they start routing around you. It's not punishment. It's efficiency. Firms don't keep paying for access that doesn't exist. The second sign came from Corvin, who called me, unprompted, which told me something in itself, to ask whether I'd had any trouble getting documents turned around on the buyer's side. I said, which was an understatement I allowed myself because it was also strictly accurate. We've had the same, she said. Our contact over there keeps saying he'll circle back and then doesn't. I had to go around him twice this week just to get a signature page. Interesting, I said, and left it there. I didn't tell her I'd expected it. There was no reason to claim credit for an outcome that was simply the natural consequence of a man overstating what he could deliver. I want to be honest about something here because I think it matters to the truth of what I'm describing. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, not in the way people mean when they talk about satisfaction. No warmth, no vindication, nothing that would register on a face if you were watching mine. What I felt was closer to the feeling of watching a bridge you predicted would fail. Confirmation, not pleasure. I had made a set of calls based on an accurate read of the situation, and the situation was now resolving in the direction that read implied. That's not gratifying. It's just correct. Through the third week, the deal's own gravity started to reassert itself. The way deals do when the people who actually understand them are still in the room, and the people who don't are being quietly excused from it. I had a call with the counterparty's lead board member, a careful, unhurried man named Aldous who'd been skeptical of the whole transaction from the start and had earned a right to be, given how much capital his shareholders had at stake. I want to ask you something plainly, he said, and I'd like a plain answer. That's the only kind I give. Your former colleague. Tell her. He's told our board more than once that he has a relationship with you that gives us leverage in this negotiation. Is that true? I considered, for exactly as long as it took to be sure I was answering the question and not a version of it that was more comfortable. I wrote him a reference last year because at the time I believed he deserved one. I haven't spoken to him since he took this role, and I wouldn't characterize anything between us as a relationship that bears on this deal. If he's telling you it does, I treat that as information about him, not about me. That's what I suspected, Aldous said. It's useful to hear it stated. It's just accurate. He didn't ask me anything else about Marcus after that, and I didn't bring it up again either. There was nothing further to say. I had answered the question he'd actually needed answered, which wasn't about Marcus at all. It was about whether I was a stable, trustworthy party to be doing business with, and the honest answer to that had simply required Marcus's dishonesty as its backdrop. The fourth week, Marcus tried to reach me directly for the first time. I saw the message come through on a Tuesday morning, a short, careful email, the kind written by someone who has rehearsed several drafts and settled on the blandest one because it feels safest. He said he wanted to touch base and clear the air regarding some miscommunication about his role in the deal. I read it once, noted the studied vagueness of some miscommunication. No admission, no specificity, nothing that could be quoted back at him later, and didn't respond. There was no clarity to be gained from a conversation with him at that stage, and no obligation on my part to provide him one. He hadn't asked me a question. He'd asked for reassurance dressed up as a request for dialogue, and I don't deal in reassurance for people who've spent it up on someone else. I want to note, because it's relevant to the kind of man I am rather than the kind of story this might otherwise become. I never once considered calling him to say I knew. There's no part of me that wanted him to understand what I'd done or to watch him understand it. That impulse, the desire to be seen delivering the consequence, is vanity, and vanity is a kind of weakness I don't carry. What I wanted was for the deal to close cleanly with the people who deserve to be in the room still in it, and for Marcus to no longer be one of those people. Both of those things were already happening without my needing to say a word to him directly. Saying something to him would have been for my benefit, not the deal's, and I don't spend effort on things that are only for my benefit when the stakes are this concrete. By the 5th week, the erosion had become obvious even to people who weren't watching closely. Marcus stopped appearing on internal distribution lists for the deal. A woman I knew slightly on the buyer's legal team mentioned, almost as an aside during a scheduling call, that there's been a bit of a reshuffle on our side. You'll mostly be dealing with me and Aldous' office going forward. I didn't ask what had prompted the reshuffle. I already knew, in the way you know the outcome of an equation before you've finished writing it out. You just have to let the arithmetic catch up to what you already understood at the start. I did learn later secondhand the mechanics of what had happened inside his firm, though I want to be precise that I never sought this information. It simply arrived the way information does when enough people in a network start talking about the same thing. Apparently Marcus had been brought in specifically on the strength of his claimed relationship with me. His new firm's leadership had wanted a way into the deal and believed, based on what he'd told them and what my reference had implied about the quality of his judgment, that he could provide it. When it became clear over several weeks that the relationship didn't extend to actual access, and that several of the people around the deal had started quietly treating him as a liability rather than an asset, his position became untenable in the specific, bloodless way these things become untenable in professional settings. Not through confrontation, but through a gradual withdrawal of responsibility. Meetings he wasn't invited to. Documents that were now handled by someone else. A title that stayed the same while the substance under it thinned out to nothing. I felt, again, no pleasure in hearing this. I felt the particular calm of a hypothesis confirmed by observation, which is not the same thing, though I understand why from the outside it might look identical. The deal itself closed in the 6th week, on schedule, with the signature I'd been building toward for a year, and Marcus's name did not appear anywhere on the closing documents. Aldous shook my hand. The closing was conducted, unusually in person, both sides wanting the ceremony of it after a process that had been unusually fraught, and said only, "Glad we got there," which from a man like him was as close to warmth as the moment required. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was nearly right. Marcus called me 8 days after the closing. I almost didn't pick up. I don't typically answer numbers I don't recognize, but something in the pattern of the calls, 3 within an hour, told me it wasn't a solicitation. I answered on the 4th attempt. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," he said. His voice had a flatness to it I hadn't heard from him before, the flatness of someone who'd rehearsed being calm and was failing at it in real time. I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd like the chance to explain what actually happened." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "You use a reference I wrote in good faith to get a job, and then you use that job to try to position yourself as someone with leverage over a deal I built. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a sequence of events, and I understand it correctly. It wasn't like that. I mean, it started differently. I didn't plan to. I'm not interested in how it started," I said. "I'm telling you how it ended. In case you're still unclear on that point, it ended with you losing the confidence of the firm that hired you, on a deal that closed without you, in a market where the people who matter now know exactly what your word is worth. That's not something I did to you. That's something that happened once the people around you had enough information to see you clearly. There was a silence on the line, longer than the pause before it, and I let it sit there. I don't fill silences that belong to the other person. If he had something to say, he could say it. If he didn't, the silence would say it for him. I lost the job, he said finally. Not a question, just a fact he was placing on the table between us. The way you'd set down something heavy you'd been carrying too long. I imagined you would, I said. I didn't do that either. You did that the day you decided my name was a tool instead of a courtesy. Is there anything I can do to fix this? No, I said. There isn't a version of this where it gets fixed. You made a choice about what kind of person you wanted to be in a room where I couldn't see you, and now the people who could see you have drawn their own conclusions, and those conclusions are accurate. I'm not going to spend any time undoing something that isn't broken. It's working exactly the way it should. I understand, he said, though I don't think he did. Not fully. Not in the way that would have required. Good, I said. I don't have anything else for you, Marcus. Take care of yourself. I ended the call there. Not abruptly. I didn't hang up on him mid-sentence. Wouldn't have wanted to give the moment that kind of drama. But cleanly, the way you close a door that doesn't need slamming because everyone in the room already understands it's closed. I didn't think about the conversation again that day. I had other things on my desk. A new mandate that had come in partly, I suspected, because of how visibly clean the last deal had closed, and I gave it my full attention because that's where my attention belonged. There was no reason to keep turning the Marcus situation over in my mind. It had reached its natural conclusion. He had made a choice. The people around him had responded to that choice with accurate information I'd simply supplied. The deal had closed regardless. There was nothing unresolved in that sequence, nothing that required further tending. I've thought about it since a handful of times, usually when something reminds me of it obliquely. A junior person asking me for a reference, a colleague mentioning someone's name in a context that requires a small act of trust. I don't think about it with anger because I never felt anger toward him in the first place. Not really. What I felt was clarity, and clarity doesn't need to be revisited once it's done its work. I gave Marcus something honest when he asked for it, because at the time it was true, and because I don't believe generosity should be rationed out of fear that it might someday be misused. Most of the time, it isn't misused. This time it was, and I responded to that misuse the only way that made sense to me. Not with outrage, which changes nothing, but with more truth delivered to the people who needed it in the order that made it useful. I don't know what happened to him after that call. I never asked, and no one has volunteered it, which tells me he's fallen out of the rooms I still move through, which is, I imagine, exactly where he'll stay. That isn't cruelty. It's just the shape the world takes once enough accurate information about a person has settled into place. I didn't build that shape out of malice. I only described what had happened, honestly, to people who were capable of drawing their own conclusions. And they drew them because that's what capable people do with the truth once you hand it to them cleanly enough to use. The reference is still somewhere in my sent folder, I imagine, unless he's deleted it by now. I've never gone back to reread it. There's nothing in it I'd take back. I wrote what was true of him at the time I wrote it, and I stand by every word of that letter exactly as much as I stand by every word I said about him afterward. Both were accurate. Only one of us treated accuracy as something that mattered. That's the whole of it. I didn't need him to understand what he'd lost, and I don't need anyone reading this to feel any particular way about how it ended. It ended the only way it could, once he decided what kind of use he was going to make of something I'd given him freely. I closed my deal. I made my calls. I told the truth in the order it needed telling to the people who needed to hear it, And then I went back to work because that's where a man like me belongs. And there was never really any question about that.
Thanks for listening.